Hi everyone, and welcome to Political Economy. My name is Dr. Gabriel Telleria, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to get to know each and every one of you during the next few weeks. For this course, we're going to be using the text by Dr. Joseph Stiglitz and Dr. Jay Rosengard. The text is titled The Public Sector. Okay, so let's get started. So one of the things that I really like about this textbook is the focus questions. Each chapter begins with a set of focus questions that you will find on the right-hand side, usually on the first page of the chapter, as you see on the screen. So let's look at some of these focus questions. Let's look at focus question number 1. Focus question number 1 asks, what are the questions concerning the economics of the public sector? To answer this question, or the easiest way to answer this question, is by looking at the economic role of government, and specifically look at the different types of government and systems and economic systems that you have in that country. For example, a free market economy is an economy where government intervention is very, very limited. The perfect example is Hong Kong. On the other side of the spectrum, you have economies like North Korea, Cuba, or China that are centrally planned economies. Sometimes we call these economies command economies, right? And in this case, government intervention is actually very, very large and controls most of the decisions that take place in that economy. Most countries, however, fall somewhere in between, what we call a mixed economy. And the United States being the most important economy in the world, that is a mixed economy. It encompasses parts of the free market economy, but it also incorporates some government regulation, some government intervention. Okay, so focus question number 2 asks, what are the differing views concerning the economic role of government? How have they changed over the years, and what has given rise to those changes? So the way that we can address this question is by taking a look back into history, right? We look back at, for example, the 17th and 18th centuries, right? And the time of mercantilism, right? What was mercantilism? Well, mercantilism was this idea that was prevalent at the time, which basically said that the way that countries accumulated wealth was through the promotion of their exports and the limiting or eliminating imports. So basically it was, how much can we produce so that others buy from us, but we not buy from them? Well, this idea was challenged in the 18th century by laissez-faire economists. Okay, laissez-faire is a term in French which means leave alone or let alone. And laissez-faire economics, and specifically the Wealth of Nations, which was Adam Smith's great contribution to economics, basically said that that the way that we accumulate wealth in a country is not through mercantilism, but rather through free enterprise and through interests, right? Self-interests that make it possible for economic transactions to take place in the market without government intervention. This idea is captured in the concept that some of you might have heard, titled or called the invisible hand, right? Adam Smith's famous invisible hand. And what is this invisible hand concept? Well, it's from the quote in The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith said that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. And this idea about how it is that things are provided in the economy, not by force, not by coercion, but rather by self-interest. So when we buy things and when we expect to have things, it is because those things are provided by us and other individuals in the economy that they are provided, not necessarily because they are being forced to provide them by a government entity. So this idea promoted by Adam Smith, again referred to as the invisible hand, is the mechanism that allowed market transactions to take place and thus provide the efficient and effective system whereby the economies could flourish. But of course, there were times in our history that when the market and free market economics didn't do what it was intended to do, or sometimes we refer to it as market failure. There have been times in the economy where things have gone really, really bad, and the economy has turned very poorly, right? And perhaps the most significant and important period of our history is the Great Depression. What happened in the Great Depression? Well, the Great Depression was the result of a number of series of events, but the most significant, or I guess the detonator, the big event that caused the Great Depression, caused the United States to enter and to fall into a recession and eventually the Great Depression, was the stock market crash of 1929. Okay, so the stock market crash of 29 basically produced tremendous unemployment. Right, banks lost. Banks crashed. Banks failed. People lost their savings. People lost their jobs because obviously firms could not employ workers because they themselves had lost all their value. And so this caused tremendous unemployment. In fact, 25% unemployment during the Great Depression. And so tremendous hardship, tremendous difficulty for the nation during the 1920s and 30s. We have seen other examples of government of market failure, which sometimes other people might refer to as government failure. We've seen other examples in history. We look back to, for example, 1987, the famous Black Monday, where the stock market crashed. And then, of course, the financial crisis of 2009, which almost produced a massive global catastrophic financial collapse. So again, some people ask, is it that markets fail or is it that governments fail? And we look at these three examples and the argument can certainly be made that sometimes the lack of government intervention, whether it's through regulation or oversight or controls or ensuring that there are no monopoly power, for example, in the economy, whatever the case may be, sometimes the reason markets fail is not necessarily because of market forces, but rather because of the lack of government doing their role and doing their job in controlling these market imperfections. Very well, so we move on now to focus question number 3. How do economists go about studying the economics of the public sector? Economists love to study scarcity. It is the fundamental principle that drives economic study, right? And what is scarcity? Well, scarcity has to do with 4 fundamental questions. What is produced? How is it to be produced? For whom is it to be produced? And who makes the decisions? That's the study of scarcity in the economy. So let's take a look at some examples to illustrate each of these questions. For example, when we look at housing, the market for housing, right? Your house, your neighbor's house, public housing, right? Who makes the decision, right? How much do we produce public housing, sometimes referred to as Section 8 housing? So who makes that decision? How much public sector housing, Section 8 housing, should be produced versus private housing, right? That is one important question. The second question is, how is it to be produced? And when we think about production, let's not forget about that production. Often when we talk about government services and government goods, it's not so much producing a good, but providing it, which is the case for the television signal or programming, right? Should programming be provided publicly or privately, right? Public programming, for those especially for those that grew up in the 1970s and 80s like myself, I remember PBS, for example, the Public Broadcasting Service, and there were a lot of shows that were provided by public television. There still are, right? But the market has increased its choices of private television, right? In fact, we have cable television, we have on-demand television, right, which have changed completely the market for programming in the economy. Then the question is, for whom is it to be produced, right? And this is an important question. If we think about, for example, things like farm subsidies, right? Farm subsidies are paid by what? They're paid by taxes, right? The government will take our tax money and decide how much to allocate in farm subsidies. But, why are we allocating money into farmers? Why are we giving farmers money and not, say, for example, bankers or dentists, right? And the reason for that is, well, we make these decisions as to what's important for us as a society to decide how much and for whom is it to be produced. So if we are working and paying taxes, and that tax money is going to be used for something, for outlays, which we'll get to in a minute, we then decide, well, you know what, farming is an important good that should be subsidized because we don't want people to go hungry, for example. So these are the types of decisions that we make in determining for whom is it to be produced. And then, of course, the big question of the four is, how are these decisions made, right? And this is where, as the old saying goes, the rubber hits the road, right? Who makes these decisions? In the United States, these decisions are not as easy as they might be in other countries. And the reason for that is because the United States has a federalist system. We are a federalist republic. We are a federalist representative republic. And as such, we have three different layers of government. We have the federal government, we have state governments, and we have local governments. In fact, we have one federal government, 50 state governments, but almost 90,000 local governments. So you can see that decisions are made across all the tiers of government, right? But this makes decision making that much more difficult and complex, right? And who decides, right? Is it the local government who decides? Is it the states that decide? Or is it the national government that decides what's best for the people, right? So things like, for example, funding the space program. Is that something that local governments are deciding? Of course not, right? That's a federal organization. It's a federally funded organization. Nevertheless, who are the citizens? Well, we are the citizens, right? And we are local, right? And we are local, we are state, and we are federal. So, the decisions do affect us and should reflect what we also like and would like to have for our society, right? Most decisions at the federal level happen in Congress, right? The House, the Senate, and of course the political play between the legislature and the executive, right? Okay, so coming back to the role of economists in analyzing, right, these questions, how do they analyze these questions? Well, there's many ways that economists analyze these questions, but one tool that is readily used by economists is the famous production possibilities frontier. Sometimes it's referred to a curve because it has a curvature, right? And This production possibilities frontier basically allows economists to determine the optimal amount of goods that are to be produced in an economy based on the capacity of that economy to produce those goods, right? So in doing that, we ask ourselves four different things, or we identify four different steps. The first one is we describe government action. So what is government to do? What is government intended to do for a specific issue or problem? The second question is analyzing the consequences, which in economics we sometimes refer to as externalities or opportunity costs, right? Externalities are those impacts of decisions that happen. For example, raising the speed limit to 90 instead of 75. Well, that's going to reduce the time people spend on the road, but it might have a negative externality in increasing the number of accidents, right? So you look at that, and then you also look at opportunity costs, which is the cost of not doing something else. So if we invest in farm subsidies, we're not investing in infrastructure, right? So the opportunity cost is evaluated. In doing that, we evaluate alternative policies, right? We look at, for example, policy A versus policy B and decide which one seems to be best for society. And then finally, and most importantly, is we interpret the political forces. And this is one element that cannot be overlooked, right? Because as we have seen, we see today, and we have seen throughout history, the politics, the administration, the economy is there, right? But it's very difficult to separate the politics from administration. Ultimately, everything in Washington and in the states and at the local level has in some way, shape, or form a political, or sometimes referred to as a partisan element, right? So we cannot overlook or understate the importance of political forces in these decisions. All right, so we get to focus question number 4. And focus question number 4 asks, what are the principal sources of disagreement among economists about appropriate policies that governments should pursue? This is an interesting question. And, you know, I love this image of a castle, right? It's a castle in the air. And it's in here. I'm going to make it bigger so you can appreciate it. So here you have a castle in the air, but notice that the castle in the air is falling apart, right? Look at one side of it versus the other. And it kind of suggests that half of the town, I guess that would be a town or a castle town, I guess. Half of the town or half of the castle is doing really well, and the other half is falling apart, right? Kind of is an analogy for things today, right? So the idea here is that it depends on the beholder. It depends on the economist and what kind of an approach that economist decides to use in determining, in analyzing, in assessing the world around them, right? It has to do with normative versus positive economics, right? What is versus what ought to be? These are the two questions, right? What is follows a positive economic approach as opposed to what ought to be, which follows a normative economic approach. Here I have two statements that illustrate each of these two different types of approaches. For example, the first one says, the minimum wage should be set at $20 per hour. Well, who wouldn't want to have the minimum wage set at $20 per hour? Especially those at the bottom, right, who are making minimum wage. But that is a normative statement, suggesting that things should be this way, right? The minimum wage should be set at $20 an hour. It is ignoring all of the reasoning behind why it should not be set, right? On the other hand, you have the other statement that says farm price subsidies in the U.S. have benefited large farmers more than small farmers, leading to a loss of general welfare for small farmers. Now, putting aside whether this statement is true or not, or half true or half not true. Aside from that, it is a statement that is making a point about something that has happened, right? Farm price subsidies in the U.S. have benefited large farmers more than small farmers, leading to a loss of general welfare. This is not what the world ought to be. This is a reflection of, at least for this person, of how the world is, right? And those are the two different types, different approaches to the economics. Okay, so moving on now to chapter 2, titled Measuring Public Sector Size. Again here, we focus on our focus questions, right? And so we'll begin with focus question 2.1. This question asks, what are the principal activities of government? All right. What an interesting question, right? What are the principal activities of government? Well, here's this wonderful cartoon that kind of illustrates that question, right? What are the principal activities of government? Well, what is the government? Who is the government? Seems to be the logical question, right? Because if we're thinking about what government ought to do, what are the activities that government is responsible for doing? Well, before we can answer that, we need to figure out who is the government. And when we talk about government, who are we referring to, right? I guarantee you that most people that you come across on the street, when you ask them about government or their opinion about government, the first thing that comes to mind is the president, right? Seldom will you have them mention a mayor or a district attorney or their representative in Congress, right? For the most part, people tend to focus on the very, very top and the head of government. But in the U.S., government is much more broader, much greater than the executive branch and the president. It actually, as we said before, it's a federalist system, and so you have 3 different tiers of government. You have the federal, the states, and the local governments, right? So that's thing number 1. Number 2 is legitimacy, right? When we think about what governments ought to do and what their role should be, well, the first thing that we need to understand and be sure about is that government needs to be legitimate. It needs to have the consent of the governed. Without the consent of the governed, you are likely not to have a government that will be able to provide, at least provide legally, the things that the polity is needing. Also, you have welfare and protections, right? If you think about the federal government in the U.S., and specifically Congress, Article 1, Section 8, right? Article 1, Section 8, which says that Congress shall provide for the common defense and general welfare, okay? Provide for the common defense and general welfare of the people. It's a very important commandment, very important mandate, I should say, that government has, because ultimately the reason we have government is to provide for the welfare and protections of the people. And then lastly, and very importantly for economics, is its role in correcting market failures, right? As we've seen in the past, government sometimes has not been able to correct market failures, and because of it has produced very difficult and negative times for society and the economy. So government's role in correcting market failures is very important. Okay, focus question number 2 asks, what does government spend its money on? How have these expenditure patterns changed over time? How do they compare across countries? Which expenditures occur at the national level and which at the state and local level? So this is a very complicated question and has actually a lot of questions within it. Let's think about, what does government spend our money on? All right, first part of the question. Well, if you look at this pie, you see that government, at least in fiscal year 2015, which is not that far back, you see that government is spending a pretty big chunk on healthcare, another big chunk on Social Security. So if you think about it, healthcare and Social Security make up almost 50% of the national budget. And then you have defense, right? And you have non-defense discretionary income. By the way, we have in the budget, we have discretionary income and we have mandatory spending. The mandatory spending is for things like Social Security and healthcare, which are mandatory, or other things, for example, providing for some welfare benefits or providing for veteran benefits, right? These things are mandated by law. But for the most part, you have these mandatory spending, but the other non-mandatory spending is things like, for example, national defense. Okay, we don't have to spend on national defense. This is discretionary spending. The government wants to spend it to keep the country safe, but it can in fact reduce it or increase it at its leisure, right? Let's also not forget the net interest, and that's very important because net interest is that part of the budget that goes to paying the national debt, right? The government, every time the government gets into debt, which the government is currently, the government has to finance that debt, and that interest payment that it pays to the Federal Reserve has to come out of the budget. And so it's important because the larger the debt becomes, the larger the interest payments become, which can have an impact on the national budget. How have these expenditure patterns changed over time? Now, I love this collage of pictures because it kind of almost, I feel like it's almost like a timeline, right? Like a time machine. You know, the first picture has a lady working on an airplane, it seems, right? And expenditures have changed as history has changed and how the U.S. economy has changed over the last 60, 70 years, right? We look back at in the 1940s when World War II erupted. The men went to fight and the women stayed behind supporting the war effort by working in the factories to build planes and tanks and other necessary items for the war, right? And so employment increased for women. In fact, the U.S. was almost at full employment during the war. And this was because those that could work, including women, were working, right? And so the tax that was generated from these income streams were used to finance things for the war, right? But of course, as we got out of World War II, right, and the country began to spend much more money on things like infrastructure, right, building roads and bridges and highway systems and dams, for example. In fact, you go back to the Great Depression and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Roosevelt's, FDR's deal for the American worker, the New Deal, was all about building infrastructure to get people working and to get the economy going, right? So expenditures on things like infrastructure were very important during those times. As we moved into the 1950s and 60s, the country experienced a change, a social change, and towards greater social justice, towards greater inclusion. A lot of this change was driven by the legal frameworks, the legal institutions, and legislation. For example, the landmark decision Brown versus the Board of Education, which desegregated schools. That was a tremendously important legislation passed by or ruled by the Supreme Court, which desegregated schools and thus created and increased the demand and the need for more spending in public schooling and things like school lunches. And that's why I love this slide, because I remember when I was in school in the 70s and 80s in Florida, and I remember what those school lunches were like, and I see school lunches today, and boy, they have gone through quite a change, and so that change is driven by the needs, the desires, the expectations of society, but also driven by the government's capacity to provide top quality, high quality products, high quality and great quality of food, right? For the children. So, which expenditures occur at the national, at the state, or at the local level? Well, as we mentioned earlier, our system of government in the U.S. is a federal system of government, okay? It's a federalist system. So expenditures occur at all three levels. And in this slide, you can see, for example, that the financing or the funding for the armed forces and funding for Social Security happen at the federal level. At the state level, you might have funding, say, for example, for the state of California, K through 12, or Ohio's Department of Education, right? And then at the local level, which could be a town or a city. So, for example, the City of Miami Police, that's financed by state budgets, right? Financed and managed, in fact, by the states. And New York City Department of Homeless Services, this is funded and financed, again, by local revenue, but also managed by the state government, right? The state government decides, or at least has an input on some of these local organizations and local services. Okay, focus question number 2.3, I'm sorry. How does government finance its expenditures? How do the sources of tax revenues differ between the national, the state, and the local government? And how have these changed over time? An interesting question indeed, because, we sometimes forget that the economy and government are linked by a very important element, and that's taxes, right? It's that essence, that glue that binds the economy with government, because tax revenue doesn't happen by magic, right? Tax revenue is the product of economic activity, whether it happens at the local level, whether it happens at the state level, or whether it happens at the federal level, right? The source of revenue comes from employment, or from consumption, or from production, right? These are all academic activities that happen at all three different levels. So the source of revenue that the government needs to finance all of these expenditures, sometimes they're referred to as outlays, is federal, state, and local. So you have your federal taxes, right? The 1040 and 1040EZ and all those forms that we fill out. Then you have income taxes, right? California might have its income tax. Florida does not have an income tax. Virginia has an income tax. So depending on the state, you have those are state taxes. Then you have sales taxes, which are state taxes for buying and selling, right? Goods, right? You go to the mall, you buy a cell phone, you pay a sales tax. You might also have these value-added taxes, which are often levied on production. So, for example, if I buy some wood and I don't pay for the wood, I pay for the value added that I generate by making that wood into a chair. So whatever amount that I sell that chair for, I will pay for that and not the wood, right? So these are value added taxes. And then there's this other type of tax, which is an excise tax. And these are levied on certain products. Some of them are imports and some of them are local. For example, things like cigarettes have a tax. And the idea for excise taxes is to not only to tax the product, but also because there is a vested interest by the government to manage, reduce, or even curb the consumption of that product, because that product has a negative health impact, as is the case with cigarettes, for example. Okay, so to summarize, I guess the one way that we can think about political economy and the role of government and how it relates to the economy is by thinking about it as a balancing act. Okay, it's a balancing act. It's too much is not good, too little is not good either, right? What is the optimal amount? What is the right decision, right? And so it's a continuous balancing act that we have to navigate through, right? Like this gentleman is doing here in the picture, right? I leave you with 4 thoughts that I hope will illustrate and help you kind of bring together what we discussed in this first lecture. The first one is that the role of government in the economy is complex and constantly changing. So we cannot think about the government and the role of government in the economy as static. It has to adapt. It has to adjust. In fact, that is one of its most important functions, to be able to adjust and adapt to the constantly changing economic conditions. The second is that scarcity drives economic analysis and government's role in the economy and society. We know that scarcity is what economists study, right? That's the study of scarcity. Things are not they are not always abundant. We don't have infinite amounts of goods, services, or money, or even time. So scarcity drives economic analysis because it drives economic decisions. The third point to make here is that American federalism makes the relationship between government and the economy more challenging and complex, right? We are unlike any other country in the world, even though there are other federalist republics in the world, like, for example, Brazil or Mexico, right? But our American federalism is unique in many ways. And it does make the relationship between government and the economy much more difficult to manage, because we almost have to go through 3 different hoops, right? Not just one. And then the last one is that taxes drive revenues and government expenditures, but are key for economic growth. And I leave this last one is fundamental and important, because we cannot provide for the common defense, the general welfare, the well-being of our citizens, if we do not have a robust economy that is able to produce the tax revenue that is necessary to be able to provide these types of goods and these types of services, right? So it's so important that the government understand its role in the economy and manage its role in the economy in the best way possible, to not undercut the economic activity, to promote efficiency, to promote investment, to promote growth, right? Because these are the things that are going to produce employment and generate the interests, right? The self-interests that Adam Smith spoke about, to get our consumers, our producers, our small entrepreneurs, our investors thinking about growth and in thinking about expanding opportunities and not reducing them. Okay? Very well. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Thank you very much.